The book in my hand had a great influence on me, and yet almost nothing is known about the author. I resolved to fix this mistake. His name was Ozan Demirel, and he was born at the beginning of the 20th century in a small village on the Black Sea near the city of Trabzon. There he lived and died. It can be understood through his writings that he was mute. He was never an important figure in the world of literature, not even locally. He published only 3 books, 2 of which are impossible to find. I have a copy of the 3rd, the only one that achieved minimal recognition. It was a gift from my grandmother. In part, this explains the affection I have for the book. It is titled Fictional and the Foundations of the World, and tells the life of a hero whose adventures reflect the highest dilemmas of philosophy. The truth is that the style that he adopts in this work makes it dense and impenetrable. I doubt that even the most enlightened academic can understand it. I confess that I am unaware of the reason why this work influenced me so much, but in that tangle of indecipherable sentences, I thought I was approaching the truth, like someone who contemplates an abstract painting and derives meaning from it. Perhaps it was his mysterious choice of words, perhaps it was just a coincidence. I was born in Izmir, and in 1992 I got my degree in Turkish literature from Istanbul University. It was the following year, during my vacation, that I began my research on Ozan Demirel. It wasn't easy to get new information. I traveled to Trabzon, and after going through archives and libraries for hours, I was lucky enough to find a collection of essays by local authors. One of them, whose last name was Atis, mentions Demirel and poetically describes him as a magical man who does not produce any sounds, pure silence. This confirmed the idea that he was mute. As I was about to leave, the librarian approached me. My arduous search made him curious, and he asked me about it. My answer surprised him. He told me that his father had worked in that same library and had heard from him an impossible story about Ozan Demirel. According to his father, Demirel was not mute. He simply lived in a world without sound. Neither his voice, nor his footsteps, nor his hand claps could be heard. We took it for a magic trick. Suddenly, the description from the essay seemed less poetic. I finally arrived at the small town where Demirel had lived. I was hoping that the elders would remember him, and I intended to interview them. I was the only guest in the only hostel. The conversation with the librarian had made my research more fun, but I didn't want to include supernatural opinions or cheap superstitions in my work. Unfortunately for me, each and every one of the elders I interviewed corroborated the words of the librarian. One of them, named Aisel, even gave me the keys to Demirel's house, still standing but abandoned. She lived in the house next door, and she confessed that in her youth she had read many of his writings, most of which were never published. The fact that I was interested in such a forgotten writer moved her, and she offered to help me in any way she could. From my conversations with the elders, I learned that Demirel had lived there with his wife, and that he was not a very sociable person. I guess he was aware of his supernatural condition, but otherwise, they were a pleasant couple. Demirel could hear his wife, but he had to tell her everything in writing. He also seemed to talk to himself a lot, although no one knew about what. He and his wife died relatively young and childless. I went into the house the next morning, but found nothing of interest. I paid a visit to Aisel, who offered me something to eat. I told her that I had already had breakfast, but my strength weakened at the old woman's insistence. While I ate, she told me about Demirel. Every day at 6 in the morning, he went out for a walk in the park, very punctual and lonely. He dedicated the afternoon to writing, and occasionally he explored the town and gave poems and stories to the neighbors. She told me that one morning she saw him in the park and he seemed to be in ecstasy, dancing and singing like a bird. As soon as he got home, he sat down to write and didn't stop for 4 days. The result was the law and the foundations of the world. I still knew many details about Demirel thanks to his wife. The two were friends despite the difference in age. I learned that Demirel had not always been like that. He had had a normal childhood until one day, sound decided to abandon him. Little by little, his voice died away, and the silence extended to what he touched. Neither the doors he closed, nor the keys he dropped were audible. I went back to the house and carefully closed the door. I stopped in the middle, regretting that I had no chance of solving the enigma. The minutes that followed were one filled with panic and paralysis. I heard a door close behind me and footsteps approaching, but there was no one there. I heard the footsteps go to the table in front of me, and I heard the chair being dragged. I knew the voice I was hearing was Demirel's, talking to himself. He talked about the pleasant walk and hoped that perhaps today his talent would allow him to write a few lines. He had a conversation with his wife. I knew because he read everything he was writing to her. At one point I calmed down. I tried to talk to that invisible ghost, but there was no answer. I put it down to a hallucination, even though I knew that what I was experiencing was real. I took the tape recorder with which I had interviewed the elders and placed it on the table. In the evening, I returned to the hostel, exhausted and confused. I had spent a day with Ozan Demirel. I just stopped to buy batteries at the town store. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I was back in front of the house, and just as I had anticipated, Demirel's spirit punctually opened the door and headed for the park. At first, it was difficult for me to follow the soft steps of the invisible figure, but soon he began to speak, and I was able to easily accompany him. My theory was as stupid as it was impossible. What I was hearing were the sounds that Demirel had produced in his time, sounds that appeared in the world about 60 years later. I worried about having such intimate access to his life, assuming that all that craziness was true. I ignored the supernatural aspects of the situation and set out to get as much information as I could about the writer. For several days, I recorded Demirel's entire life. Unfortunately, he seemed to be going through a creative block and was unable to write anything decent. I thought that perhaps this event should be studied by someone more competent than me, but I didn't want to be taken for a madman, and at the time, I didn't trust my sanity either. Finally, there were surprises. I got home at 6 in the morning, as always, but Demirel didn't show up. I entered the house, and everything was silent. On the way to the park, I heard screaming. It was Demirel, singing, completely elated and radiant. I remember Isel's words. The day Demirel sang in the park was the same day he started writing his masterpiece. So it was. He ran home and I followed him and got the tape recorder ready. Those were 4 days of magic in which I was able to admire the creative genius of the artist. Oh, how I appreciate his habit of talking to himself. The book, which had seemed to me as inspiring as it was incomprehensible, became simple, and its secrets became transparent and definite truths. Demirel had touched the foundations of the world and spoken of how liberating these ideas were and how dangerous they could be. The fear of spreading such a powerful view of the world made him decide, on the second day, to hide the simplicity of his discovery. He tangled the text with impossible metaphors and the most complex of grammars, a kind of filter so that the power of truth would not fall into the wrong hands. Having recorded everything, I decided to return to the hostel. For a moment, I thought that spending so much time in that house would make me part of that hallucination. From the threshold of the door, I contemplated the town in silence. I took a step, and panic seized me. My foot had made no sound, or was it my imagination? To make sure, I took one more step. Well, I hope you enjoyed the story, and if you want to see more, please take a look at the other videos on my channel. Have a good day.